So I'm going to talk about designing for dispute resolution. So a lot of systems don't really seem to be designed to resolve disputes. And I can sort of understand why that might be, because if you've already worked out how your system might fail, then the answer might be, well, you should fix it rather than trying to find out a way of resolving disputes that result from a system failure. But people have attempted to try to help resolve disputes, and a common way is redundancy. And this is useful for identifying the presence of a problem, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how to resolve it. So one very common approach of this, so dating back to the 13th century, is double entry accounting. So if you've done any sort of finance management, then this is probably what you've seen before. This works by each party having a balance of stuff. It might be money, it could be something else. And you cannot create money out of thin air, you cannot destroy money, all you can do is move it. And you move it between accounts that have these balances. And so whenever there is a debit to one account, there's a credit to another account. And at all points in time, the system should balance to zero. So if you add up all the accounts, then everything cancels out, it should add up to zero. If this is not the case, then there's an error. But this tells you there is an error. What do you do at that point? So obviously this is applicable in situations where there's money, but also when there's sort of inventory management. This sort of double entry scheme is often used. This is important because the cases of computers managing money or stuff in the real world are exactly where dispute management is going to occur. Now you can understand why double entry accounting came about. So in the top right corner is Luca Pacioli, who wrote about this in 1494. And they were dealing with merchants in different locations, not necessarily part of the same family, and therefore there was trust that was being transferred from one party to another. And so they needed this redundancy to check when things were wrong. But when things have gone wrong, and you know this because of an imbalance, what happened and who's to blame? And it turns out this often doesn't work very well. Where this has definitely not worked well is the Horizon computer system. So this has been in the news in the UK recently, but it's really a story that's running for decades. So this is the computer system used by post offices to manage their branches. And this is another case where trust has been shifted, because this is not post office employees managing post office money. This is independent contractors working on behalf of the post office, but using post office resources. And Horizon is the thing that is meant to keep track of who owes what to whom. And it turns out it's got bugs, of course. It's a computer system. It's not bad, but it did have bugs. Here's a screenshot of it conducting an emergency repair. And when one of these bugs happened, it sometimes resulted in money disappearing. And when that happened, often the sub-postmaster was prosecuted for fraud. There were over 900 of these who were prosecuted criminally. There's more who have been prosecuted or who've lost money in other ways. And this only recently got resolved through a long and expensive court case. And what was discovered is that the post office were not disclosing what they should have. Had they done so, it would have been apparent that the computer system was buggy and falsely accusing people of fraud. Something is going to be done. There might be some individual consequences for people particularly to blame. Probably is not as much as we would hope, but there probably will be some. But there could also be changes in the law to require that computers demonstrate that they're working correctly before you rely upon those functions. So why did this problem take so long to resolve? Well, certainly the failures of the post office were a cause of this, but one is that actually Horizon did work properly. It identified that there were misbalances. Sometimes these were errors, sometimes fraud, sometimes just a bug. So for example, a real example, a book of stamps got moved from one location to another. It actually gets created into two books of stamps, and now there is an imbalance, and that gets blamed on the sub-postmaster. There's a corresponding imbalance on the other side, and this, it turned out, eventually became profit. that says £100, actually £100 million ended up in this suspense account for stuff that was not kept track of. This is maybe okay if it's the company accepting the losses, but it's not going to be the case otherwise in the post office. So maybe we can do better. Like, blockchain is incredibly hyped. It does a lot of things badly and inefficiently, but one thing it does do is it actually keeps track of every individual thing moving around, at least in the Bitcoin network. So every unit of currency has an identity. It can be tracked for good or for ill. And this is not double entry accounting, because it's not just balances we're keeping track of, it's things. So could we do something like this for things? Not all the inefficiencies of blockchain, but just have a ID for every item and then see where it is. So if there's duplicates, deletions, incorrect movements, it all becomes much easier to diagnose. And you actually don't need much storage. Like, you couldn't implement this in paper. You couldn't do this by hand in the 13th century, but you can implement it in a smartwatch. So it's quite tractable. So maybe this idea of traceability of items, learning from blockchain, is one idea for dealing with evidence critical systems. So that's a system where a failure to produce reliable and interpretable evidence could cause serious harm. And maybe there's other things that we can do for these sorts of evidence critical systems. So I'm quite interested in what other people might have views about what should be done if you are building a system to show its reliability. But also, maybe this isn't the first time this topic's been looked at. So what resources are you aware of that people should look at who are interested in this topic? So I'll be putting this up at the evidencecritical.systems webpage. And if you're interested in more information, there's also a mailing list you can subscribe. Okay, thank you.